está temblando un poquitito. No se asusten, vamos a quedarnos. Les doy la hora. 7 de la mañana, Chihuahua, 7 de la mañana, 19 minutos 42 segundos, tiempo del centro de México. Sigue temblando un poquitito, pero pues vamos a tomarlo con una gran tranquilidad. Vamos a esperar un segundo para poder hablar.
During this live broadcast of the Mexico City Morning News, communication with the outside world was abruptly cut off. Mexico descended into silence. Minutes later, thousands of people lay dead or trapped in the ruins of apartment complexes, hotels, hospitals, and other public buildings. The force of the disaster was impressive. This was the most violent earthquake in the history of Mexico. Registering 8.1 on the Richter scale, its magnitude was considered the highest observed in this century in the Western Hemisphere. In the few minutes that the telluric movement lasted, an estimated 420 buildings in scattered pockets of the city were completely destroyed. Approximately 50,000 of Mexico's 1.4 million buildings suffered damages.
Vamos a la cabeza, aquí arriba. Para que lo reciban.
In an immediate and impressive display of national solidarity, thousands of people, mostly young volunteers between the ages of 14 and 20, began searching for and rescuing victims, often removing the concrete debris with no other tools than their hands. Many survived the quake and were rescued despite the adverse conditions. Thousands of trapped children and adults stoically withstood, some for days on end, a lack of food, electricity, and water. More than 14,000 victims received medical care in improvised first aid stations and hospitals that were left undamaged.
Nos evacuaron porque no hay agua, volvió a temblar, los edificios, todos los edificios que nos están rodeando.
Fortunately, most of this city of 18 million was unaffected, but the impact on the affected areas was dramatic. The earthquake caused losses that will take years of effort and millions of dollars to restore. In the health sector, 3 large institutions were seriously hit: the Mexican Social Security Institute's Medical Center, the General Hospital of the Ministry of Health, and the Juarez Hospital. During the critical stage following the earthquake, the use of some 5,000 beds was lost in these 3 buildings alone. The damage to the telephone network was the greatest in communications history. 14,500 local lines were cut off, and long-distance service was interrupted completely. For several weeks, the amateur radio network, whose role was invaluable, provided the primary link with the outside world. On September 20th at 7:40 p.m., a second earthquake with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale struck, aggravating the situation and causing panic among the population. At this hospital in Mexico City, victims of the first quake were still being treated when the earth began to shake again.
Foco que está prendido y no pasa nada. Tranquilidad nada más.
Está temblando.
Todo nomás que guarden orden. En una zona que es eminentemente sísmica, como acaba de suceder. Bueno, el edificio ha resistido extraordinariamente bien, no hay ningún problema, pero estamos causando pánico constantemente a los pacientes.
Entonces, que bajen todos corriendo también, porque
no, lo estamos haciendo, hemos pedido que sea con calma todo. Está el ingeniero aquí.
Pues yo siento que el edificio está bastante dañado, está fracturado. Tiene bastantes fracturas, así es que no podemos saber si ya no va a temblar, si ya no tiembla. Les comentaba que puede quedarse así, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Pero puede haber un pequeño temblor
Y que precipite algún problema.
y que haga que se colapse el edificio.
Lo que yo estaba recomendando era una evacuación tranquila, cerrar el hospital y posteriormente, cuando las cosas hayan tomado su cauce normal, regresar y evaluar.
A power failure and loss of electricity compounded the problems. Although emergency generators were activated, there was only enough power to illuminate the first floor. Elevators, incubators, and other patient care equipment requiring electricity were not operable.
¿Que nos ayudan? Nosotros vamos al cuarto piso con los que están ahí. Agárrate la camilla. Vamos al cuarto piso. ¡Vámonos!
Scenes such as this occurred in major hospitals all around Mexico City. Meanwhile, the fear of further seismic activity caused residents of the affected areas to leave their homes and move to parks, open spaces, and improvised shelters. Rescue work continued all through the night in the area of the disaster.
No nos comunican nada, no nos dan ninguna comunicación, no nos identifican.
Sí, están reportando los nombres de las personas que están desaparecidas. Necesitamos saber el informe. ¿Mande?
No nos quieren informar nada.
No quieren que nos vayamos a trabajar. Nosotros queremos trabajar.
Outside the Juarez Hospital, hundreds of anxious relatives of patients trapped inside the hospital waited impatiently for several days for news of their loved ones. And at the same time, another drama was unfolding inside the hospital. An estimated 750 staff and patients were trapped as the building collapsed. Hundreds of national and foreign rescue workers, physicians, nurses, family members, and other volunteers organized rescue teams to frantically remove debris in the hope of finding survivors among the ruins of this once active medical care center. An estimated 191 people were rescued alive.
Organizarnos en grupos de 10 gente, quiero que se empiecen a alargar hacia adentro del inmueble. No, porque si ellos saben que se empiezan a meter para que después se metamos. Nosotros vamos indicando de la parte dura, cuando haya ruido de gente viva, entonces metemos un grupo de franceses. La cosa es, vamos quitando de las cosas que impiden el acercarnos hacia la parte exterior del edificio. Que asesoren ellos. Yo les quiero comentar algo, yo soy ingeniero. Esta cosa no le va a pasar ya nada. Nos tocó el temblor del otro día y no se mueve absolutamente. Entonces, pónganle confianza, vamos a hacer huecos hacia adentro, vamos a buscar a ver qué gente vive todavía. Entonces, háganse de allá y vamos a orar. Vamos a hacer grupos de 10 gente metiéndonos al edificio.
¡No hablen! ¡No hablen!
Silencio. ¿Hay alguien ahí? ¿Hay alguien ahí? No puede hablar, entonces en la pared.
Approximately 1 week after the first quake, rescue operations were still going on.
A la brevedad posible está aquí la
This woman had to have both legs amputated in order to extricate her from beneath a concrete block that had fallen on her. When she arrived in the hands of a team of physicians aiding in the rescue efforts at this site, she suffered cardiac arrest.
Toma bicarbonato. Un gramo de bicarbonato. Bicarbonato, pásale eso. Pásale bicarbonato, sí, por favor. Pásale 5 folletos.
Nevertheless, this highly trained team was able to save her life with cardiopulmonary resuscitation.
Un poquito más para atrás. Pero no vamos a hacerlo.
The human tragedies, as well as other extraordinary cases of survival, moved the entire world. 24 hours after the disaster, flights began arriving from the U.S. and other countries. The planes unloaded all kinds of rescue supplies, including over 400 tons of pharmaceuticals. It would have been preferable for international donors to have waited until the needs of the country had been properly and accurately identified. This would have ensured that the aid actually contributed to improving the situation rather than increasing confusion and disorder. Most of the drugs were not requested and could not be used. None of the boxes was classified. Many of the drugs had been opened, and in many cases the instructions were in foreign languages. Volunteers, often medically untrained, spent hours opening these boxes one by one, classifying the contents and organizing them the best they could. Furthermore, the drugs were often mixed with other items, such as used clothing.
Por favor, no destapen esas cajas de ahí, se los
A ver, ¿quién las está destapando? No destapen todas estas cajas.
Esas cajas déjenlas ahí como están, que ya están.
¿Quién las destapó?
One of the most distressing tasks was locating and identifying the bodies.
¿Por qué no te forman?
This baseball stadium in Mexico City was used as a makeshift morgue, and most of the bodies were brought here. The bodies were kept in ice bags for 72 hours to allow relatives and friends the opportunity to identify them.
Cálmate, aguántame tantito. ¿De dónde viene?
Chihuahua y Jalapa.
Chihuahua y Jalapa. ¿Trae nombre? ¿Este es de los de la escuela?
Sí.
Mira, vamos a ponerle aquí prepa. Porque andan todos los familiares. Ya está identificado, aquí estamos.
Identificado, aquí estamos.
A ver, perfecto. Rodríguez Escobar y también de
Many of the cadavers were already decomposing or had been disfigured by the impact, making identification difficult and at times impossible. This only increased the anguish of those who were searching for their loved ones. After 3 days, the unidentified or unclaimed bodies had to be buried in common graves, an unpopular measure. The presence of corpses caused further anxiety. Much of the affected population and many rescue workers believed that the decomposing cadavers could cause epidemics. This unfounded fear led to the implementation of symbolic steps to calm the public. This same myth, deeply ingrained throughout the world, led people to demand vaccinations against any conceivable type of disease. Various voluntary groups administered these vaccines until health authorities were able to explain through the news media that epidemics do not arise spontaneously in such cases, and that mass vaccination was an unnecessary waste of resources. One of the most serious problems was the drinking water supply. Because of the damage done to distribution networks, more than 1 million people were left without water. The demand for water rose with the need to fight the fires caused by gas leaks. In response to this crisis, an emergency treatment and distribution system was established. Tank trucks and other vehicles transported and distributed drinking water to people who were without it. Yet, even as thousands of leaks in the system were being repaired, impatient individuals were breaking other pipes in their eagerness to get water. A potential risk did arise for an increased incidence of waterborne disease as a result of the water supply crisis created by the earthquake. However, a public education campaign to boil water and observe personal hygiene measures was largely successful. The population responded with a high level of responsibility. The only registered foci of infection were due to improper food hygiene. The problem of water quality control and hygiene was complicated by the fact that most of the victims took refuge in public squares and parks, or simply on the sidewalk. As has been seen in other countries, few people moved into the shelter set up for this purpose by the authorities. Most camped near their destroyed homes, where they could keep an eye on their property and perhaps recover some of their belongings. The tents and other improvised structures built by the displaced persons soon began acquiring the characteristics of small, permanent settlements, with all the basic elements for continuing with daily life. Despite personal tragedy, human nature demands a return to normalcy.
A llevar con tranquilidad también el asunto, pero buscando ese gol que empatara la situación. España jugó inteligentemente hasta el partido en que ya de plano Juan simplemente
However, the crisis was not over yet. For many, such as these children who were rescued, the nightmare continues. Their physical injuries may heal long before the psychological trauma recedes. They experienced not only the terror of the earthquake, but the anguish of losing relatives in it.
Diles adiós. Diles adiós. Diles adiós y gracias por todo. Ándale. ¿Qué pasó? No, ya no me haga pucheros. Ándale.
The earthquakes of September 1985 in Mexico City attest to the vulnerability of large cities to catastrophic earthquakes and should serve as a reminder to all Latin American countries, the U.S., and some Caribbean nations. Preparedness is the key. The health sector must constantly improve and refine its state of preparedness. A quick and efficient response to health concerns such as mass casualty management or water supply problems in highly sophisticated urban areas is of paramount importance.